So, I'm going to ask you all to introduce yourself first, and just a quick, who are you?
Which end?
You go first.
I go first. Hi, everyone. So my name is Tim Retzloff, and I am a historian. So I bring that hat to the table here today, and I'm very pleased to have been invited to be part of this panel with people that I know from my own incarnations here in Ann Arbor. On September 14th, 1952, Edward Weber arrived in Ann Arbor to go to library school and work at the University Library. And that evening, he went to a place called the Ideal Bar. And as a historian, as someone who loves do-it-yourself, I did a booklet with all these spaces. So I'm just going to have this as an opening thing. So he came to the Ideal Bar. He had come out in Rochester, New York, where he was from. The Ideal Bar, which I guess was at 117 East Washington, was a gay bar. And the next day at work, at the library, one of his supervisors said, "So, I understand you went to the Ideal Bar last night." Now, this is 1952. Smack in the middle of what historians know as the Lavender Scare. Being LGBTQ, as we now understand it, was criminal. It was considered a sickness. He certainly could have been fired. So, you know, as a 30-year-old man, he suddenly understood that he had to mind his P's and Q's. Which is not to say that Edward did not live a rich, full, fabulous gay life, but just kind of some LGBT, some queer spaces, if it's okay to use that word, are known to outsiders, and some aren't. And the ones that are known to outsiders then can kind of have some consequences. Now, some of that's changed, and I think in the course of our discussion here today, we can talk about changes, tremendous changes that we've witnessed, and some that we've only heard about. So, is that good to start off?
Yeah, that's
okay.
perfect.
My name's Kelly. Along with my business partner, Kate, we opened Common Language Bookstore in 1990 and ran it for 13 years before we were lucky enough to find some fellas to take it over for us so the store could keep going. To riff off Tim a little, back in the olden days, I would say the first gay space I was in was a space that I did not recognize as a gay space until a long time later, and that was my high school gym teacher's office, where two other future lesbians and I hung out throughout our high school experience and were clueless. I mean, I was kind of clueless anyway until I was about 25 or something. But looking back on it, I realized, oh, what do you know? There we were, and how stereotypical can you be? But it was nurturing for me, and thankfully it gave me a little spot, and we will talk more.
Excellent. My name is Martin Contreras. As many of you know, my husband and I owned the Aut Bar here in Ann Arbor and Common Language Bookstore after Kate and Kelly retired. I came to Ann Arbor to go to U of M. My first visit to Ann Arbor, I'm from Southwest Detroit, near Mexican Town, and it was literally 40 miles from Mom's front door to West Quad, so it was just far enough, but not too far, that I, if needed, had to head back home. I got an undergraduate degree in psychology and a diploma from the School of Medicine in physical therapy, and that was my professional career. Mom and Dad both owned restaurants when we were kids, and I worked in them since I was old enough to reach the counter and started, being a short order cook in junior high and was opening the place by the time I was in high school and doing buying and selling and, running to the Eastern Market. And I swore in high school I would never open a restaurant because it just took over your life. And I should have paid attention to that. Once I got to U of M, it kind of started, I kind of knew I was different in high school and sort of wanted to hang out with the boys, but didn't really think of it as, a sexual attraction. I just knew that I, felt most comfortable around other guys. And because of Mom's Restaurant, I knew, seniors, and I was in junior high, and we were friends with much older kids, 5, 6, 7 years older. But I started putting 2 and 2 together once I got to U of M. Mom kind of blamed the university and my college education for coming out. So I started in a career in physical therapy and decided to open a Mexican restaurant near Caringtown. I guess that would have been 1986 we opened. And one thing led to another, and we opened, closed one business and opened up another one. So that's how my sort of life in Ann Arbor.
I'm Keith Orr. I started off in a different career as well. I was a musician. To riff off of what he said, I spent a lot of my time avoiding being a musician / waiter. I was be a musician / anything else, a lot of tech stuff, that sort of thing. But and then I met him, and anyone who knew Martin in 1986 got dragged into helping him at the restaurant. So that's how that happened, and ultimately, of course, led to the Aut Bar. I guess my first gay spaces for myself was the Flame Bar. After arriving here in Ann Arbor in the mid-'70s. And then probably Community News next, because that's where you could get all of the gay papers from all over they had the Bay Area Reporter, and there's a Washington paper whose name I don't remember, and our historian probably does, and would gather those things. And I was so excited when a gay bookstore opened on 4th Avenue. First Common Destinations, and then crossed the street to Common Language. So in '95, we opened the Aut Bar, and sometime after that, ended up purchasing Common Language. And when a space opened up next to us in Brown Court, we managed to purchase the building and move Common Language down there, creating what the kids at the time called the Queer Quad. And what was it that Michelle T. called it? The
Homoplex.
The Homoplex, right, yes. So that's how I arrived at that spot. I was a musician for some 20 years, playing in an opera and opera pit and orchestra. I don't do that anymore. Back to our moderator.
Wonderful. I was wondering, so if we could go back even farther, before you became owner-operators, what was the scene like? What spaces were you in? You talked about the Flame Bar. What did the spaces look like? How were they meaningful? I don't know, anything related to that, spaces that you encountered. And
I'll jump in here because it goes in on Kelly and I were talking about this beforehand, some of those, the way spaces were perceived. The Flame Bar was certainly a space that was meant to be very much separate from the rest of the world. Though there was a big plate glass window in the front, you would never know it. I think the last time it was cleaned was in 1958. And of course, there was no...
still smoke.
Right, I was just about to say, this was well before a smoking ban. So it was fairly opaque. And very much a typical dive bar. The women would occasionally frequent there. It was certainly known mainly as a men's bar. As I said, that was the first space gay space I encountered in Ann Arbor. Community News was over here by Liberty Plaza, down on the first floor. And it was, a little bookstore, but it also had in the back the gay porn section, but also had a whole bunch of other gay resources. And they did have some gay lit. So, this was where I bought my first copy of Tales of the City, things along those lines. But it always felt like, other than that one little corner, it wasn't really your space. So it was just so exciting. When Common Destinations first opened, it was distinctly, just as the Flame was distinctly a men's space, even though women would occasionally go in there, Common Destinations was distinctly a women's space. And I would go in there I remember, I think first time I was in there was to get a Christopher Graham novel. And it was sort of like getting these stares like, what are you doing in here? And it's like, just buying this book, may I? When we bought Common Language, it was something we talked about a lot because it had been a struggle after Kate and Kelly took over Common Destinations and changed it to Common Language. It had been a struggle to get men to feel comfortable coming into that space. But it was something that was very important to them. And I think they were very successful at it. It became more than just a bookstore. It was a community center, and I'll let Kelly talk more about that, but the number of organizations that began in that basement could fill up another pamphlet probably. And so similarly, after we bought it, we had a similar situation of trying to convince people that, no, we aren't just selling gay porn. We are a full bookstore, and women are still very much welcome at this location. Those are the spaces I'm most familiar with.
Well, I'm going to jump in here. I was much too closeted and still figuring things out to, A, even realize there was a gay bar in Ann Arbor, and 2, going in there was really frightening to me. So it was a long time before I went into the Flame Bar. And there was no internet, and there was no hookup sites. So most of reaching out to other gay people was either through helplines, the Human Sexuality Office at U of M. I think it was my first art fair as a freshman. I stayed around Ann Arbor, I guess maybe sophomore year. Saw Jim Toy sort of giving a pep talk and talking about the community, talking about the Human Sexuality Office and the importance of being out, and that there are many gay people out there, and visibility. So I think that may have been my first real exposure to there are other people like me, because I certainly knew, in junior high and high school that I was attracted to other boys, and didn't quite figure out that that was a sexual attraction as well. But my biggest fear, and I've told this story many times, and Jim had heard it as well, that my biggest fear when I walked into the Human Sexuality Office, which was like on the 3rd floor of the student union, all the way to the back, and there was walking down corridors, and all I remember is there's no windows, it's dark, it's spooky. But I got, the information I needed to figure out what my next steps were, if you will. Yeah. So, they introduced me to, went to meetings and ended up meeting people that in Detroit. And I remember the first time I went into the Flame Bar, I circled and circled and circled. And, it took a few months of that, like circling the block or walking around the block for fear of bumping into, someone would see me going in or coming out. And then I finally did it and figured out if I'm in here, then those other people are gay too. So sure enough, I ran into some teaching assistants who were also gay. And, it opened up a whole new world of other folks like me and created friendships.
Yeah.
And that chosen family, if you will. So many of us struggle with coming out to our immediate family for fear of losing our immediate family or being pushed out of the home. And you sort of create your own circle of friends and you create a chosen family. So that was happening for me as well.
Yeah, hats off to Jim Toy,
Yeah.
who established the first gay and lesbian center on a university in the country, 1972. I also took that long walk down that corridor, and it was sort of in the Union, on the way to West Quad. It was sort of like a Harry Potter building. There were these little half floors, and you went, but they had library.
Yeah.
So for me, I wasn't so comfortable. I didn't want to talk to anybody, but I could take a book and take that book home and look at that book. The word is out. Do you remember that documentary? Read that book and think, oh my gosh, wow, I am a lesbian. What do you know? And here's this office, and here are these church, life on campus is easier than life off campus. There was some Christian group that put on dances, remember, every Friday night or one Friday night a month at, I don't even know where it was, some building in Ann Arbor that was
There was a
just
Canterbury.
women.
Canterbury.
Canterbury, that was it, Canterbury. Canterbury put on dances. There was a group called Oasis that put on women's concerts. And if I have a theme, my theme is this: one or two people make these things happen. And going forward into the present and into the future, it was these two guys who started the Aut Bar. It was these two girls who started Common Language. It was two women who started the Michigan Women's Music Festival. If you want to see it was me and Charlie that started Aqua, a queer swimming team. It only takes one person to say, this is what I want to see in the world. Let me go find some people who want to bowl. There was a gay bowling league. There was a gay running and walking club. There was the Leaping Lesbian, which I believe we have one of the founders of in this room right now. Two of the co-founders, two women can make this happen. Little newsletter for lesbians in town, get to meet each other. I want to talk also a little bit about that period in the 70s and 80s, I think. There were a lot of code words for lesbian. One was women, as in women's music, Michigan Women's Music Festival. Another was softball, as in, are you playing softball? There were some out lesbian teams. There were some closeted lesbian teams. There was some very ferocious competition between the out girls and the closeted girls to prove who was right and to, prove something. Another code word was karate. You could go anywhere in the country. If you wanted to meet lesbians, join the karate club. And there's where they were. What else? Help me out, girls.
Bookstore before.
Yes, and so I was not part of, Tim and I thought it was called Women's Space. Looking at my notes, I think it was called a women's bookstore.
A woman's bookstore.
Originally,
Upstairs on Liberty Street.
first on Liberty, and then on 4th Ave, upstairs from Footprints, now across from the co-op.
And there were also there was like a women's clinic up on that same floor. That was,
Right.
I didn't know that. Free clinic, I didn't know that.
That wasn't just lesbian, but the people's free clinic.
The-
Yeah.
Yeah,
yeah.
so you could go and learn, how to get your service.
Oh, that's right, that's right. I never had the nerve to do that, but hats off to you who did. There were also CR groups. That was kind of another word, I believe, for a code word for lesbians. But, they were kind of study groups. People got together and talked about what was going on, read feminist writing and talked about that. One person can start that.
And there was Herself, a newspaper for women, for lesbians, and also the Gay Awareness Women's Collective, HARC, who met the same place, 225 East Liberty, up above what is now Afternoon Delight, where the People's Free Clinic was, and, yeah.
And the original women's bookstore, yeah.
I got them both. I didn't make the address connection. So I have Feminist House, which is where Gay Awareness Women's Collective, which my understanding grew out of the Radical Lesbians, that some of the women who had been involved in the earliest lesbian-specific organization on campus. And Cindy Gare, who co-founded the office with Jim Toy, was a member of Radical Lesbians. One thing I do want to note about the office is for its first 20-some years, it always had co-directors, and they were always adamant about having, gender parity. And this time when we're kind of challenging binaries, we don't always kind of appreciate how important it was back then, when kind of the norm was that men and women didn't always interact, that the program, what became the Spectrum Center, Steve Culver was joking about how many names it's had over the years, but as a space and as a place to ensure that people are welcoming is really crucial. So I'm from Flint, grew up in Flint, so my very first gay space in Ann Arbor was Ralph Smith's dorm room in East Quad. And my friend Mary, this is my senior year of high school. I had just turned 18. I worked at the Flint Public Library. And Mary and I took the bus from Flint. I still remember going down 23, the first time we rounded the curve, and there's the city. It was like Oz, because I had never, it was just, and it still retained some of that magic. So her brother was a first-year student here, worked at the McDonald's that they fought not to build and is now long gone. And he lived in East Quad, and he had a group of friends that played D&D. And Mary, though, this whole time was like, well, you have to meet Ralph. So, but Ralph was busy, and at some point, well, we're gonna go for breakfast with Ralph at Angelo's. So, and I'm just like kind of heartbroken to know that Angelo's is closing. So I remember like a Sunday morning, she gives me his dorm number, 300 Cooley, and I knock on the door, and I hear, "Is that you, Tim?" And it's like, yeah. So he opens the door without a shirt on. I'm 18, he's 21. And the first thing he did was he took me over to a bookshelf and pointed to this book by Don Clark, Loving Someone Gay. And this is the thing about queer space, is sometimes it's fixed and sometimes it's not. And Esther Newton, in her fabulous memoir, My Butch Career, talks about her first lesbian experience in her dorm room in Markley Hall in 1959. And that, just what a common experience for someone who has felt alone and never made the connection whether it's romantic or sexual or social, but even the one-on-one space, that once you enter it, it becomes queer. And I just kept thinking, as Kelly was talking about Jim Toy, it's like Jim Toy walks into a room, that becomes a queer space.
Yeah.
Well, all this talk about books, too, hats off to the librarians. How many of us, before we had the big gay read and things going on all month and celebration of gay, and you just go on the site and the Ann Arbor Public Library is telling you about being gay, and so you know that there are gay people, etc. How many of us went to the library and took out the dictionary and looked up homosexual, if you were lucky enough to even know that word, or talk to a librarian, and the librarian held your hand and took you to a safe place and showed you that the future was going to be better for you. So thank you.
Thank you. That's so funny. I just brought up a memory I have to quickly tell. Was first time I heard the word was when Brian Epstein, the Beatles manager, killed himself. And the newspaper referred to him as an avowed homosexual. And I was like, what's that? And I had to go look it up in a dictionary, and it was like, there's a name for it. That's when I learned it. But I want to go back to what you were talking about, Tim, about the gay spaces and how different, what makes a gay space, right? And because certainly that's something that we think about a lot since we sold the Aut Bar, which was really the only full-time gay space, the Homoplex, and you know, we thought we were leaving it with a future ahead, and of course it did not work out that way. And it's something that we look around and we see, what do we have now? And to your point, there are gay spaces out there, you know, whether it's the library, as you talk about, or you know, the North Star, which is, you know, one night a week explicitly gay, but certainly has a gay sensibility 7 nights a week. The long-running Fridays at Necto, which, you know, doesn't make Necto a gay space, but it makes it a gay space on Fridays. And but it, we think about it when there are things to celebrate or mourn. When there was the excellent memorial to Jim Toy at the Michigan Theater, and afterwards we're like, where do we go? What do we do? And as it happens, Sandy and Linda were just like, let's go to Brown Court. So we went to Brown Court, and the bar at 327 was open yet for another 15 minutes or so. So we ordered cocktails and just sat on Brown Court and, you know, communed.
I think we stayed there till about 2 in the morning.
Yeah.
And it became a bring
Until
your
they
own,
kicked us out.
bring
Oh,
your
wait,
own
no.
food, bring your own booze, and there's about 20 of us.
And so it's interesting because there's nothing about Brown Court anymore that marks it as a gay space. And yet, you know, it's powerful enough, its history, that it was a gay space. It's a place that we were able to go. And I think that's one of the things that, and we're probably, I don't know if we're moving way ahead of ourselves here, because we've talked some about the history of gay spaces. But, you know, what are gay spaces moving forward? You know, there's certainly, you know, internet gay spaces, but, you know, as we discovered during the pandemic, we require in-person connection. It's part of what we are as humans. And I'm not sure how we move forward from there. We were visited a couple of years before we sold the place by a guy named Gregor Mattson. and he was doing working on his dissertation, and it was about gay bars. And he ended up becoming Dr. Gregor Metzen. Good for you, Gregor. And the dissertation ended up becoming a book, Who Needs Gay Bars? We love it because chapter 2 is the Aut Bar. But it's interesting because he talks about, there's a lot of people go around who are documenting the loss of gay bars, and even more radically, the loss of women's bars. There's so few left now. But one of the things he's looking at is the ones who are surviving. What's going on with them? Are they hanging on by a thread? But he finds that the ones that are succeeding very well. And it's because that they are doing more than just being a bar, which is what we collectively, bars used to be, always used to be more than just a bar. One of the things that frustrated us about the Flame was, as we were first discovering it, was during the last pandemic, AIDS. And the proprietor of the bar, after...
Harvey Blanchard.
What's that?
Harvey Blanchard, let's put his name out
Well, actually, by the time AIDS was hitting, he had passed
there. He
away.
had passed away,
So it was
the new proprietor.
the new proprietor, who was straight. Well, so was Harvey, actually. But and he had bought it as a cash cow. He had nothing to do with the community. And I remember one of his bartenders had set out a collection jar for what's now Unified, HIV, Health, and Beyond. At the time, it wasn't even HARC yet. I believe it was still Wellness of Huron Valley. Right. And had set out a collection jar for it. And he made him take it away. He said, AIDS is depressing. It's bad for business. Get that out of here.
Wow. Wow.
And, as we traveled around and you go to like anywhere else, bars were where money was being raised. Bars were where awareness was being raised. Bars where buddy systems were being set up. Bars were where you found out what was happening with people. You'd see, a memorial service poster. And Ann Arbor's transient enough, if somebody disappeared from the scene, we didn't know, did they move or did they die? Because we just did not have anything at the time, a social setting that was also a community setting. And I think that's, when you come down to what a gay space is about, ultimately, I think that's what it has to be, what is the community function of that space, whether it's a bar or a library or a bookstore.
I was going to interject that bookstores are also disappearing, as many of you know. Keith and I always made a point to find the local gay bookstore wherever we traveled, New York, San Antonio, Chicago, and at a time it was always, there's one there, of course we'll find it. And then, as time went on, they were harder and harder to find, and gay bookstores were closing, and there used to be probably a dozen in Michigan alone. Yeah. And we were down to, Keith at one point I think counted 12 in the entire United States. I remember my first gay bookstore was Chosen Books in Detroit. Yeah. My first gay book I bought was Lesbian Nuns Breaking Silence.
Still a classic.
Yeah, still a classic. I still have it.
Still inspiring.
Having gone to Catholic school my entire life, it's like, I know that Sister Regina Mary and Sister Conradine were more than just nuns. But, gay bookstores are such an important part of coming out, discovering yourself, and exploring the world of gay literature.
Yeah, and really, what you're talking about, there's really a change in generations also, starting from the Flame Bar and the bars before that were largely run by the mafia. They were just cash cows for somebody. They weren't run by gay people for the purpose of creating a corner bar kind of atmosphere where your neighborhood got together and, You found out, when the kids were graduated from high school and, that level of community development. Before we get too much into the present, I wanted to say one more thing about what Martin was saying about in those days where if you were going to walk in the Flame Bar or if you were going to walk in Common Language, you felt like the spotlight was on you. And everybody for 4 blocks around was looking at you, and they saw you going into this gay place, and they knew something about you. And even though nobody was really looking, we intentionally, when we set up the store, set up the layout of the store, you still had to be brave enough to cross that threshold. But we tried to give you a little cubby where you could go behind and have a little place that was invisible from the street so that you could dig into all your books and do what you had to do without being on public display and without feeling like everybody who walked down 4th Avenue saw you in there and was taking notes about you. And one other thing that I wanted to say about Common Language and about the Aut Bar is that we intentionally, and I think you intentionally, sought a location that was downtown, that was part of the mainstream, that was a way of saying, yeah, we're a gay, lesbian, feminist, and we are standing shoulder to shoulder with every other business in Ann Arbor. We're here, we're queer, we're part of this community. And I think Aut Bar also.
Yeah. We very much, when we decided to open a gay bar, we thought, we had the Mexican restaurant in Broncourt already, had a good 9-year run, and we were looking for a location. We wanted to open a place that was positive, affirming, and gave back to the community. I think those were part of our 3 or 4 things that were important to us, and to be visible. And it had to be a positive and affirming space. I always felt like you become your environment. If it's a open and affirming and happy environment, then you become happy and positive individuals. So we purposefully had windows that were open and sunshine was coming in, and it was all welcoming. And it was just enough off the beaten path, but it was in a very popular part of town. And so it was a risk. And I thought, well, we own the building. If it doesn't succeed, we will have a very snappy-looking condo in the Carytown area.
It would be a great party house.
It would be a great party house. Thankfully, it did well.
One more thing, and I'll quit butting in on you. But something I had never thought about before we had the store, and a tangent about gay spaces, is, okay, we opened Common Language in 1990, so that's pre-AIDS, kind of, in Ann Arbor, kind of, pre-internet, certainly, pre-Amazon books. So we're operating along there for a couple of years, and eventually a middle-aged woman comes in. She is the mother of a high school boy who is gay. She's a nurse. She knows he's gay. She's really worried about him, and she is looking for information about HIV and AIDS because she is pretty sure he is gonna get HIV and AIDS, and she wants to know how to tell him to protect himself and how to care for him once he's sick. And I think she was from Adrian or somewhere out of town, but that space, I mean, that was very poignant to me, that was something that we had to offer her, and made me understand that we weren't just us ourselves, we also were a bigger community.
So there's a couple things that I want to follow up on in terms of the Flame and also the Rubaiyat. So in the 70s, there were these 2 bars. Ann Arbor was basically a 2-bar town. But downtown was in economic decline at the time. It was kind of a seedy place, both of them. They were places you go at night. but there was also kind of this interaction between the community and what they wanted out of these spaces and what these straight owners were willing to give. And in the case of the Flame, there was a period where they were really unfriendly to women, and they wouldn't allow cross-dressers.
Right.
And the Gay Liberation Front, Jim Toy and Company, picketed the Flame, and you can, the Michigan Daily is now digital and online. You can go look up these photos of young queer folks picketing the Flame in 1973. The Rubaiyat had become popular, and Alice Eccles has a book called Hot Stuff because she DJ'd at the Rubaiyat for a while, so you can get some of the flavor of the Rubaiyat in its disco heyday. But there was a point where the owner would not allow women to dance together. And Gay Awareness Women Collective protested. And one of the members of Gay Awareness Women Collective was Nancy Weschler, who was on city council. She and Jerry DeGreek had won their seat to city council in 1972 on the Human Rights Party. They were not out when they were elected. They were responsible. They were key in getting the ordinance passed in 1972. And so Ann Arbor's on the vanguard of that, and also having the first publicly declared Gay Pride Week in the country. But they weren't out. But this event at the Rubaiyat, where they said, well, we got this ordinance. We want the police chief to enforce this. Women should be able to dance together. It should be safe space. And Weschler, and then DeGreek, after her, came out on council and became the first elected officials to come out publicly. So there's this interaction about demanding of these owners what they want the space to be. And the time frame for this is different in different cities and towns, but LGBTQ ownership of these commercial establishments is really, really, really an important component of what happens. And as we're losing this space, we're kind of losing, in some ways, this caretaking or curating or, it's, when the mafia, the protection racket is very different than when we're owning things and the protection that we're providing. And I think that kind of flows from what we've been talking about, and then kind of really important because Ann Arbor is a unique place because, I'm not sure that would have happened in the 70s in any other place. I mean, over time it's happened in lots of places, and we're refighting these battles over and over again. But 1972 and 1973, to kind of have that kind of public pushback and assertion of we want these spaces to be what we need them to be.
Right. I think it speaks to taking care of our own, our own families, our own friends, our chosen families. I've often said this, but I don't know if it's true. Maybe, I tell people, it's like, Aut Bar, Keith and I were the first gay-owned gay bar in Ann Arbor ever. And I don't know if that's true, but it seems to me that's my perception.
I'm not sure. The town club, the owner never married. So.
How about out
Openly gay.
Right. No, and it was a pre-Stonewall bar, so who knows?
Yeah. So people are always curious about that fact that Ann Arbor would have such a long history of gay community, but didn't have many gay-owned gay bars.
Right.
But it is about taking care of oneself.
Indeed, it's to bring it back to gay spaces, right? Curating the gay space is something that gay, and I'm using, because I'm old, I'm using gay in the all-inclusive term here, queer space. Queer spaces have to be curated by queer people. And when they are, it means they can be life-saving spaces. much like you were talking about with the woman from Adrian who came in. And, you know, why do we need, who needs gay bars or more, you know, who needs gay spaces? I mean, yeah, we've come so far since, you know, I was growing up in the 60s, in terms of like kids being able to see other queer people and understand that they might be. But you look at the statistics, and it's still a very dangerous thing to be a queer kid. That's, you know, whether it's any of them, but certainly most specifically these days, trans, it's very dangerous to be a trans kid. And queer spaces are the spaces where they can, that can be life-saving for them, because they can find the support they need and understand that there are other ways out of the way they are feeling other than killing themselves, frankly.
Y'all are really making facilitating easy. Just over here crossing off questions.
We've had some time to think about these things over the years.
Yeah. I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about some of the tensions that might arise from that, of like you have this deep commitment to community and you want to foster these relationships and community and all of this, but you're also running a business.
Yeah.
So like, were there certain challenges that you had to deal with, and what was that tension like?
Who wants to pop
start?
Our biggest challenge we had, you know, when we were running a bar and restaurant, and, you know, you have to have people to show up to wash dishes and cook and prep and clean and serve tables. And at the end of the day, it's like you're running a business. And I realized somewhere along the way that we were hiring mostly queer folk. And a lot of us, because of our environment that sometimes was not welcoming back home, that we were damaged in some respects, or came with a lot of unnecessary baggage. And at that time, they didn't need a boss, they needed someone to be affirming. And so I saw a lot of that over the 23 years. And, you know, that had to sort of keep that in mind. It's like, you know, everyone's struggling at one point or another. And if they can find a home here and become who they're meant to be, then we're successful, we're happy, they're happy. But at the end of the day, it's like, it had its challenging.
And there are also the things that, you know, when you're running a business, you're trying to control that business. And sometimes that can be very difficult when you get pushback from the community in some ways. And that would happen sometimes, where, you know, you'd get pushback about, why aren't you doing it like this, right? And, you know, the first reaction is like, it's my business, I'll do it how I want. But you also, if you stop then and think, wait, part of this being a business is that it is a part of the community, we have to find a way to address the needs of all of the community, even if it's not something that I saw as a top priority. You'd at some point have to go, oh, somebody else is. So, yeah, there were those challenges.
I think for us, because we had such a big operation and needed so many, there were so many moving parts and needed so many people to make it happen. You know, if we were just running a bar and restaurant, that would have been easy. But, you know, Keith and I, being who we are, always felt a need and obligation to be involved in, you know, community events, city politics, state politics, national politics. You know,
Wine events.
What's that?
Wine events.
Wine events, you know, raising money for our local aid service organization.
Yeah.
So there was a lot of things we were doing, not just running a bar and restaurant.
Yeah,
So
yeah.
we were being pulled in many directions.
For Common Language, it was a lot simpler because for a long time, it was just Kate and me.
Yeah.
And the two of us could run the store. And then we hired an employee who was also had it was her second job. And, you know, I was in my 30s. I didn't really care that much about making money, and I made enough to live on. Same with Kate. But as time went on, she had 2 kids. And she, after I think about 10 years, she couldn't live on that little money anymore. She had to start thinking about her kids a little bit more. So that's when she stepped out of the business, and that was when I realized I couldn't stand to step out of the business, so I had to keep it for a little while longer. But a big boon for us was going to the festival, the Michigan Women's Music Festival, and selling books there. You know, there were between 6,000 and 10,000, given the year, lesbians from all over the world, really, who didn't have access to these books and this information. And that was economically very lucrative for us and carried us a lot. And it also was a total blast to have, you know, these women from Australia and these women from Switzerland and from everywhere, from, you know, rural America, who had never seen this stuff and were just hungry for it and eager and, you know, wanted to look at everything you showed them, and were just, you know, eating it up. And it reminded you of, yeah, you know, this is why we're doing this. This is great. And times changed somewhat too. You know, after when we started, Amazon Book Collective in Minneapolis was a lesbian bookstore, but pretty soon Big Bad Amazon changed book buying for better and worse. I mean, it gave access to those people who lived in the hinterlands, who could at least see what books were being published and available, as long as Amazon would put them on their platform. But back to the economics, after a while, we met some really right-on women in the nursing school and in the women's studies program who ordered their course books through us. And that was really helpful for
A long time.
For a long time.
Yeah.
For a long time, and I think, and they
We continued.
continued to be supportive. And straight women, too. A couple of those nurses. I mean, what you really see, too, is you have allies. It's hard to realize that sometimes, but they're there.
Yeah, and they did, the textbook helped us quite a bit for some time, but that changed as well.
Yeah.
And so at some point, actually selling textbooks became a money loser for us.
Yeah.
And we could not go to Michigan Women's Festival because one of their rules was that any business that was coming up there had to be woman-owned. So it wasn't even like we could send our women employees there. So that wasn't available. But we did do a lot of Pride festivals.
Yeah.
It was a lot of work, but it was also a lot of fun. And the more the hinterlands it was, the more fun it was.
Yeah.
One of the best ever was always going to Holland, Michigan. You know, I mean, we think of it as the center of Calvinist thought in Michigan, and it is, but there are queer people there too, and it was just the sweetest little setup they had in their downtown park. You know, most places you go and it's in a big field and everybody's in rows, and their downtown park has these like winding paths, and so all of the tents are set up on winding paths. But the people there were just
such a need.
so hungry for it. It was, you know, reminded me of prides of my past, where it's not just about going and dancing, it's actually about, and this is something else, I guess, common about those queer spaces. It's one of those feelings of, I have found my people, right? And I think especially older folks thinking about our early prides, that was, you know, oh my God, there are, you may realize there are other people like that because you see them in small numbers, but when you see them in large numbers for the first time, it can be overwhelming in a good way.
We had many, many joyous experiences being both owners of Aut Bar and Common Language Bookstore, just outside of our core business. We used to joke that, you know, how folks will tell their bartender anything. They will also tell their bookseller anything. It was like, that's where our two worlds were very similar. It's like-
Actually, we called it, the counter was called the Truth Bar for a while.
Yeah, because people would come in Common Language, you know, when we were down in Broncourt, and they would have these life experiences, and, you know, a trans parent, a
Oh, my
trans
God.
child, someone who has
Yes.
AIDS in the family, or,
I just remembered this young Muslim kid who was here to study from overseas, who came in the store and was hanging around and, you know, kind of comfortable, kind of uncomfortable. And he wrote me a little note and folded it all up and left it on the Truth Bar and went away. And I opened the note and he said, "I think I might be gay. I've never told anyone this before. Do you think I could come back to your space?" Yeah, really. Yeah. And another, I'll be quick, another straight man who loved to cross-dress, who used to cross-dress and come in the store and just, you know, wanted to be in a welcoming space. And he would call me on the phone about every other month just to check in and come in, and he found on our bulletin board a seamstress who would make dresses for larger sized people, and yeah, it was very cool.
Wonderful. I'll say the Truth Bar exists also in the library
Yeah.
counter.
yeah, of course.
Certainly. I'm going to turn it over to audience questions, but before I do, I have one last question, which is just, what is your hope for the future of gay spaces in Ann Arbor and everywhere? What do you want to see?
Well, I'll jump in first. I certainly think there is a need for a, in our case, a gay bar and restaurant that is gay-owned and run by the gay community. And I'm hoping someone will step up and meet the challenge. There's nothing like, I'm Mexican-American, and, you know, our family came up from Texas, and then they came up from Mexico, and as people migrate around the country and settled in Detroit, there's always the Mexican neighborhood. And that's where you go to find your people and feel whole and feel welcomed and feel yourself, and you're kind of strengthened by that, and you're emboldened to go out and do what you need to do to earn money and work and interact with other communities. But, you know, when things get tough, you go back to, you know, Mexican town. And it's the same thing I always thought about our gay community, our queer community. It's like, you know, you gather at the bookstore, you gather at the bar, you gather and sort of deal with celebration and loss and politics and, you know, families that don't understand us, friends who don't understand us. And I think we still need those spaces, even though there's the internet and there's lots of more positive role models on TV. But I still think there's a need for it, and I hope that someone will step forward and open up that space.
We have in the back there, I see Terry McClymon's back there, who jokes that, or when he was still a bartender, would joke that as long as you can't get booze over the internet, my job's still safe.
Yeah.
And I think that's goes back to something I was saying earlier. It's like we need the human connection, and so that's why I completely agree. And it may not, you know, who knows what form it is. Maybe it's not a gay bar. Maybe it is a gay coffee shop that has alcohol, right? And there's an article in was it this month's or last month's Observer about places that are serving alcohol that aren't necessarily bars, the tea houses, the Argus cafes, that type of thing. So, maybe it's more of that type of a space that we're looking at, I don't know. I'm retired, so it's not me that's going to find
Yeah,
it.
yeah.
But I hope someone does, because I would happily stop by there.
I think the hard hit for Ann Arbor, once we retired and sold Aut Bar, was that it also meant the Common Language closed and Jim Toy lost their building
Yeah.
in terms of their own space. So when we sold, it was like, this thing we had built up over 23 years.
Curated.
Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah.
Started to,
Yeah, and I agree. I think it's important that it's a commercial space that's open 7 days a week, so that when you need to go or want to go or can figure it out to go and can meet your friends there, it's not Friday night at the Necto or Tuesday night at the bingo at Wednesday. Tap room, thank you. And I will put in a plug for this. Before Kate and I started the bookstore, we said to each other, do we think there should be a bookstore in Ann Arbor? Yes. Have we ever been in a gay or women's bookstore? No. Have we ever worked retail? Either of us? No. Do we know what we're doing? No. Are we going to do this anyway? Yes. And, somewhat, we were lucky. We were in the sweet spot of when there was interest in it. The women's bookstore movement had happened, so people understood what was happening, and we could riff off that and make it not just women. But you don't have to know what you're doing. If you're going to run a restaurant, I would not advise that. But for a scaled down, a coffee shop, you can probably do it if you don't know what you're doing.
I think the trend has been to have pop-ups, like big events. Prides are now proliferating. It's kind of amazing that Taylor and Hazel Park and Canton are having prides. And some of the bars that I know about in Detroit that have managed to survive because they have events and they reinvent themselves. But I think I agree with Kelly very much that there's something about having like a stable space that is safe, that's community driven. And I think there's some ways in which the Spectrum Center might serve that purpose for students on campus. But Ann Arbor, I'm probably gonna upset the powers that be, but Ann Arbor is more than just the students and the University of Michigan. And I think the best places have been able to bridge town and gown.
The queer quad.
But Ann Arbor's also become an expensive place to be. So how do you create that space, and how do you ensure, it can't be just, once a year in Wheeler Park, or at times that you need. We clearly know that we can fill a room and come together and make connections here, but to kind of do it continuously over time and develop friendships and relationships, that's something that you have in physical spaces that qualitatively is so different than even online interactions. There's just something about interacting with other human beings, and that we're,
Vital.
yeah. So I don't know what that means, but even having the vision is kind of the first step. And I think some of it is like, okay, new generations are gonna, time to brainstorm and whether you're an entrepreneur or visionary or whatever, you know, help make this happen.
Maybe someone here. All right, we have some time for questions. Jacob has a mic, so if you want to raise your hand, he can pass that around.
I have a question about music. If there were safe spaces or safe groups in your music career, Keith, because my son's trans and he's in Germany and will probably never come back to America. And he's an opera singer, but he graduated from U of M. And I just wondered if you found some of those groups. He does on and off in his work.
I think it's changed a lot since when I started. Interesting, I went to my last 2 years of high school up at Interlochen, and I was closeted while I was up there. I had tried coming out. This was like, when I was a sophomore in high school in Madison, Wisconsin, another progressive place, but it was also 1971. And the reaction was so horrible, that even from friends, that when I went up to Interlochen, it was like, it's a whole new space. I can just, forget that ever happened. And so it was several years after that before it came out again. And it's funny, because when I talk to people at Interlochen now, it's like, we're thinking of getting rid of the GSA because it's just not needed. And it's interesting because, of course, the arts are filled with queer people, right? And yet it's only more recently that a lot of that has been openly spoken about. When I was first in Toledo Symphony, there was a bus that used to take us back and forth because they needed so many musicians from Ann Arbor. And a buddy of mine and I formed the, let me see if I can remember what we called it, the GMCTSO, Gay Men's Caucus of the Toledo Symphony Orchestra, which was he and I. And there were other gay people, we were certain of it, but we were the only two openly gay people in the orchestra. I was on the negotiating committee for 3 contracts, and it took me all 3 contracts to finally get a non-discrimination clause in there. We did finally get it, but boy, there was so much resistance to it. So I think it's changed a lot now, that people are, just as in society they're able to come out, even in the arts we're seeing a lot more of that. I mean, some of the major composers of all time, but just think of American 20th century, the Aaron Coplands and Leonard Bernsteins and all of that. But for the most part, that was not a part of their identity at all when they were alive and composing. But again, it's been, I left the symphony in '95, and from everything I can see, there's been huge changes in the way openly queer people are treated in the arts.
Well, we have 2 people here from California, Molly and Nancy. I wonder if you have insight on what gay spaces are working and are successful.
I moved away from San Francisco.
Can you use the microphone, please? I'm sorry. You scared me,
So I lived in San Francisco for about 30 years, 27 years maybe. And I worked at the San Francisco Public Library at several branches, but then at the main library where one of my responsibilities was LGBTQ collections for all ages. And my experience of community in San Francisco outside of the library. There were a couple of bars that people went to, but, you know, bars were disappearing there, and it was more like, you know, Tuesday night at, you know, this or that bar. We had a queer knitting group for a while that was at in the cafe of the LGBTQ community center. And, you know, I'm sure there were other things, but it didn't feel like a big sense of community there to me. Although, I mean, we got good attendance at library events. So I don't know. Molly?
Yeah. Kelly, are you asking about physical spaces?
Or more, I'm asking about what strategies have been successful in creating a queer space that's a safe space for people and.
Yeah. I left Ann Arbor, moved to the East Bay of San Francisco, East Bay, around 2012, so haven't been there that long. And I know of some queer spaces. There's a community center, gay community center in San Francisco. There's Open House, which is another center for 50 and older LGBT community, trying to create housing and community. There is a gay community center in Oakland, and I wouldn't really know about gay bars or haven't heard of gay restaurants. Certainly not to say they don't exist. I just wouldn't be I'm not the out and about.
Fair.
I think one of the things from Ann Arbor perspective, in some respects, we really are a small town. And we did not have the luxury, unlike a New York, Chicago, or San Francisco, where there's a men's bar, a women's bar, a leather bar, a suit bar, a twink bar, you know. We are the bar for the entire community. And Keith and I spoke about this a lot in sort of developing the Aut Bar before we opened of, you know, who are we serving? And it's all welcoming, you know, which is why, you know, we chose equal number of male and female images and trans images on the wall. Why we picked a name that included the entire community. It wasn't the Anvil, and it wasn't the Flamingo, and it wasn't, you know, the Waterworks. You know, it was something that we thought, we had 200 names that we thought a lot about so that everyone would feel like, you know, we can all go. And we could see that, you know, different communities socialized at different hours. You know, women tended to come earlier and they went home earlier. They had enough sense to do that. Men stayed out much later, never had enough sense to go home. You know? So, and gay and straight. Yeah.
Some other queer spaces in San Francisco, AA had does still have very strong queer presence. There's a LGBTQ synagogue that was started by gay men and then expanded, and that's very active. Strong leather community, very active. So things like that. Yeah, well, but the Castro's being taken over by straight people. I mean, yeah, I mean, even like during Pride, it's like there are a lot of gawkers. And it's sort of disappointing. It doesn't have the same feel that it used to have. But it's there.
Bars and restaurants.
Yeah.
This is the wildest thing that's ever happened. Ryan Huey, your wife, Andrea, is locked out, and she has the baby with her, so if you could call her. Wife? Ryan Huey, wife? Yeah, maybe they're not here.
Ruh-roh.
But this could, here, back to the questions.
Is that what he told his wife?
So I just have a question about, that's come up in what the conversation we've been having already, and that is about community centers. So the commercial space versus the community center space. And I'm just wondering, the thing that I notice about the businesses that you represent is that they are known to be these businesses that just barely are on the edge of profitability. And bookstores, perilous now. And even restaurants, it's just the industry, right? You're always, the margin of survival and restaurants is always, just so close. And so that suggests instability. I mean, you all had incredibly long, stable, and I'm sure that was through incredible effort on your part. But if we were thinking, let's invest in a community space that we think is going to be really stable and last, we might not pick a restaurant or a bookstore nowadays, So I'm wondering, what about community? I know the Jim Toy Community Center, group still exists. They are looking for a space. But I also noticed that existed in your time, and some other people, you were mentioning communities. It seems like maybe you don't think community centers are really the answer, or there's some reason why, and I know, Tim, you've done a lot of studying of these spaces too. I'm just wondering what you think about community centers versus these commercial spaces, and could the community center become the more stable space of the future, especially because community centers you can raise money for. They can be nonprofits, they can, right? So I'm just wondering about that. What do y'all think about it?
Community centers are a vital piece of a strong gay community. We're fortunate to know Dave Garcia, who is, just one of the brilliant people in the world of community centers right now. And I know he's been talking some with the folks at JTCC, Jim Toy Community Center. Sorry, let's use anagrams without letting people know. So the JTCC, of course, they left Brown Court shortly after we had left. They have not had a space since. They're having a lot of challenges. I hope they can work through them, because I think having a community space center can be really useful for a lot of things. One of the things Dave's brilliant at is getting people coming in. He's the executive director currently of Affirmations, and he's doing things about healthcare, about mental health. Yeah. He's brought a theater in there. The Metropolitan Community Church meets there. Sage meets there. So, there are a lot of resources that a community center brings together. Yeah. And, there are certainly some social aspects to that as well. And those are the type of things that a bar cannot do, right? Yeah. I mean, well, maybe some of those you can, but certainly not all of them. Certainly not mental health. So, it's an important component to the community. But I think that the community needs a social interaction that a community center has a hard time doing. It provides a lot of infrastructure. And in some cases, talking about California, the gay organization that has the largest operating budget in the world is the LA LGBTQ Center. And they do just amazing things. They have a political side. They just opened up a space that is housing for both homeless youth and elderly, and they coexist, which is brilliant. They get this intergenerational stuff going. So, I would never knock a community center because they do great work. But you also need people who can make them happen in ways that are activated. And I think one of the problems that the Jim Toy Community Center had was that it had not been activated for some time. They had a space, but it really was not very well activated. And so it needs a group of people who understand how that dynamic works. And I think they're well-meaning people there. I think they have a lot to learn. And I hope that, and I think they are trying to. So that's all great. But I think that's something that provides infrastructure. I don't think it builds community.
We got this gentleman right here with the mic.
Yeah.
Could someone elucidate the audience regarding the W.H. Auden house?
So Auden was here in the early 1940s, and his boyfriend soon followed him. So I think when he was here, he was a queer presence. And when Chester arrived, Chester rented an apartment on State Street with Strone Robertson. It became known as Coleman's Corner. And then Strone Robertson left. They both graduated. Chester went back to New York. Robertson came back in the 50s and ran a theater troupe and was notable as a part of kind of this underground gay community, this discrete queer community in Ann Arbor. So there's kind of this linear line. So Edward Weber remembers Strone Robertson being around, and Marvin Eisenberg, who hosted parties. He was with the art history department on the faculty for many decades, and was subject of Seymour Kleinberg's book Alienated Affection. Talks about the importance of these house parties to him as a grad student here. So I'm kind of putting those spaces as kind of a nod to a different kind of queer space than we're familiar with now, but also kind of a through line that generation to generation there were people who knew each other. And I just found out, compiling this, that Strone Robertson actually lived at 437 Hamilton Place, which was where Edward Weber lived starting in 1960. So Ann Arbor's a small enough town that there's a lot of these spaces that overlapped and that people knew each other, but we don't always know that they knew each other. And the other piece about space that I think is really important to talk about, in how they're queer spaces, is part of what makes them queer has to do with stories, and the stories that we tell about them, and the experiences that we have, and then share with them. So even though the Aut Bar is closed, even though Common Language is closed, we still have stories to tell about them. And I will always remember, like, Ann Tracy was a longtime LGBT bibliographer for Michigan State, who I got to know when I was doing research there, long before I became affiliated with MSU. But Ann Tracy would make pilgrimages to Common Language to shop for special collections. So, there's all these kind of intricate connections that all have to do with stories and kind of needing to have the space that's both physical and kind of temporal to be able to share stories, I think is a really important piece. And I just think it's kind of magical that the Ann Arbor District Library, and I'll give a huge plug for their online portal, which if you type in LGBT, you'll just be dazzled because, 10 years ago, it wasn't there. There's pictures of Kathy Kozachenko and Nancy Weissler and Jerry DeGreek, and the picture of the flame that's on the cover of this is from this collection. All kinds of stuff that had been in the Ann Arbor News. So I think it's reassuring to know that, maybe maybe these spaces won't always look like we expect them to, or that they have in the past. But you know, this evening, I'm really appreciative of the queer space that we've created together, so.
I think we have time for one last question.
And right here?
It's not a good closing question.
Okay.
On the topic that Keith was talking about with Interlochen feeling that their environment has become so inclusive, they no longer require the GSA. Can you guys like verbalize some reasons why it's really important to still actively seek out and create queer communities, even though we may feel included in spaces that aren't explicitly queer?
Yeah, I think I touched a little bit on that, but yeah, absolutely. Who needs gay bars, right? It's safe spaces are so important, and it's one of the reasons why I think the Pulse nightclub shooting touched our community so hard, was because that's a safe space that was invaded violently. And so if you're thinking of safe spaces and they can be, attacked the way they can be, it's terrifying. And I go back to that thing of, I mentioned earlier about the suicide rate among LGBTQ youth. But even though it's most profound there, even as adults, there's so many things that we have to weave. Coming out is stressful. It just always will be. No matter how well it turns out, it's stressful to do it because you don't know what the result is going to be. And we have to do it all the time, right? It's not like, oh, check that off my list, I've come out, right? I mean, we all know that there's always the process. Oh, first I'm coming out to, my closest friends, and then, and ultimately family and all this, but we still continue to do it. If I'm checking into a hotel and it's not a gay hotel, I'm coming out when it's like, no, we want the king bed, not the, two twins, two queens or whatever, yeah. Well, two queens want the king bed, right? But and I'm certainly, much more comfortable doing it now than I would have been 40, 50 years ago. But it still is something we do, and every time there is a bit of stress to it. And so I think, having those safe spaces where I can go in here and sit down, and it's like, I remember those times when I could just walk into the flame, and it's like the stress just washed away. It was like, I have found my people, right? I don't have to come out to the person sitting at the stool next to me, or that is, playing pinball with me, or whatever it is, that level of stress is gone. So,
And in the school, it's a way for the schools to say, these kids count. And and that's really important. The GSA is as important as the science club and the football team and the blah, blah, blah.
Geography club.
Geography club and the chess club, which is all gay anyway. But also I think it's important because there are allies all around, and they're looking for a chance to be supportive too. So that gives them a chance to step up and say, this is part of who I am too. I'm for you.
I think for me, the important thing about a queer space, and it may be a restaurant, it may be a bookstore, it may be a bar, is finding your chosen family. And I remember when, for me, walking into the Flame and then meeting folks who were into the theater, or were into music, or into photography. It was like, oh, I'm not alone, and there's other people who share interests, and they're like, come on, try out for this play. Come on, hang out with us at home. And those are still important things in one's, feeling comfortable with oneself and discovery. Because, it can be rough at home, and it can be rough at school. It can be rough with friends who don't understand.
All right. Thank you all so much for coming. You've been a wonderful audience. I really appreciate your time, your listening, your focus. Thank you to my panel. You've been so great. Just really thank you so much for sharing your wisdom and your experience in all of this. There's a couple things on that table as you walk out. First is this little amazing book that Tim put together for us with all bars and spaces listed. Feel free to take one of those. There's a zine out there as well by Tim, if you want to quickly mention what that is. Or just...
The Come Out in Detroit is a comic book that my friend Isabel Claire Paul of Ypsilanti, 24 years old, and I, who will be 60 next year, put together last year for the 50th anniversary of the first Pride celebration in Michigan, which involved people from all over the state, both planning it and participating in it. And we were thrilled to get a grant and do a GoFundMe, and we got 20,000 plus copies printed. And so there's still some copies available, and we're also currently in works of getting it into public libraries. So if you have a public library that you know should have it, let me know, and I can steer you to how to make that happen. So
Thank you. Yep, those are out there, and they're free to take. Thank you. Good night. Yes.
Very good.
What kind of, what
If
was
anybody
it?
didn't hear that, it's Dyke Night at
Dyke
Braun
night.
Court.
Wow, nice.
Braun Court.
At 3:27.
At 3:27? Nice.
Yeah.